Hello, welcome to the surface of the sun. Not really, I do know the sun is hotter, but it's a really hot day right now on the Gold Coast. And I'm going to talk to you about a book that's a little bit unusual in my channel. This is a non-fiction and it's The Birds at My Table with high reflective index. Why We Feed Wild Birds and Why It Matters by Darryl Jones. This is a great little book. I bought it a while back. It's been on my to-read shelf for a while. It's not the first book that I've read by this author. Darryl Jones is a professor and director in Environmental Futures Research Institute in Griffith University up in Brisbane. He's published a lot of books. They're often about birds and they're often about urban ecology. So back in the 80s, when people still didn't believe that the words urban and ecology belonged in the same sentence, where serious ecologists went off into the bush to find somewhere never touched by mankind before, as if you can even find very many of those anymore. Back then, Darryl Jones was already starting to look at native birds, wild birds, that were in urban environments. He's got some great work on ibis, and I think the original 80s study that he did was about crows in Wagga Wagga. He's from Wagga Wagga, New Zealand, by the way, but lives in Brisbane. Okay, so I talk a lot about classic SFF on this channel, but I do read a lot of non-fiction. I tend to not review it as often because I don't forget non-fiction. I read it more slowly. It fits into my worldview more, whereas I read SFF quite fast. This was a marvellous book though, and I want to talk about it. I know at least a couple of people who watch this channel are Australians. Pretty sure that a couple of people are bird people. So this book, if you are a bird person or an ecology person or interested in Australian ecology in any way, and you have not heard of or read this book, I do thoroughly recommend it. I do not benefit in any way from this recommendation. I don't even have a signature in there, but it's a great book. It deserves to be better known. I'm going to go through it a little bit chapter by chapter here. So the preface, and I've made notes. I've made lots of notes because it's a big book. Okay, so in the preface, Darryl Jones talks about how he came to write it, and that's a wonderful story. And he's obviously a very well thought of, very accredited scientist. He's collaborated all the way around the world. He did a fellowship in America that comes into the book as well. Academics don't always write well. They may be the best researcher on earth, but that ability to cross into writing that is enjoyable and engaging for the popular science market isn't always there. With Darryl Jones, it is absolutely there. The preface absolutely hooks you. It gives us little tasters from all the way around the world. Maine, USA, Wales, Gwyneth or Gwyneth? I'm not sure how to pronounce that. W is ooh sound, isn't it? But Gwyneth, I don't know. If you know how to pronounce Welsh, tell me how to pronounce Gwyneth. But anyway, there's birds there and studies done. Wellington, New Zealand, and of course Brisbane, Australia. So in our preface, Darryl Jones tells us that he has a feeder at his house, which is a strong commitment from an Australian, because in Australia, as this book goes into, the argument about to feed or not to feed wildlife is strong, often passionate. It divides families more strongly than politics. It is an ongoing discussion, an ongoing, strongly opinionated discussion even. So chapter 1 is why bird feeding matters, and it really does go into the subtitle. Where's the subtitle? Why bird feeding matters. Number 1 doesn't have a subtitle. It goes into Australia, the ecology and the balance, and it specifically goes into lorikeets and magpies, which are 2 of the birds that appear on his particular bird feeder. Magpies, by the way, in Australia are not corvidae. They're not old world magpies. They're actually a kind of butcher bird, but we call them magpies because Australia was settled largely by English, so you know. He also talks about the initial study from the 80s that I already mentioned in Wagga Wagga, and estimates about how many people feed birds. And he talks about how these estimates come about and where they got them from. Some of the main ones are the United Kingdom and Australia studies. In USA, a lot of the studies were actually federal studies, which makes them very well funded and very widespread. But he talks about where the research comes from. So, chapter 2 is called Crumbs to Corporations, the Extraordinary History and Growth of Bird Feeding. And oh wow, is this a great chapter for anyone who likes birds and history. So, someone has done their research in ancient history. It talks about the origins and early mentions, the earliest possible mentions of people engaged in feeding wild birds, and they seem to come from the Hindu Vedic works 3,500 years ago or more. There's also mentions of it in the Old Testament. The New Testament kind of peripherally mentions it. But a really interesting one was ancient Egyptian texts, which talk about a huge amount of organization that went into feeding wild birds. Apparently, during the times when people were mummified and laid to rest in huge tombs like the pyramids of great fame, mummified birds were often found in there. I knew about that. I'm pretty sure it was hawks, maybe ibis, not sure. But buzzards? Oh. In any case, in order to provide these birds, they had a very systemized feeding, harvesting, and preserving method. So that was interesting. Darryl Jones in this chapter also gives me yet another book to add to my to-read list. Thoreau wrote Walden, or Life in the Woods, and that apparently is a great book and mentions wild bird feeding. Now, in this chapter, he also mentions the Great Blizzard of 1891 in the United Kingdom, which may have been when people started seriously feeding birds over winter in the UK, but certainly there were mentions of it. There were writings saying people should help out the birds because they were in distress. We then go to a German treatise from 1908, which was translated, How to Attract and Protect Wild Birds, a full description of successful methods, and it's based on the work of Baron Hans Freiherr von Berlepsch, something like that. Anyway, great story. This baron had a huge ancestral tract of land, and he really did systemically trial all the types of food and building things, and it sounds like an amazing book too. But then that chapter 2 goes into more modern feeding, and it starts to talk about how it became an industry, a multi-million-dollar industry in many countries, providing bird feed of different kinds and equipment for the feeding of birds. Chapter 3 takes us to the big change, and the big change is where the big debate about feeding animals, and I think this was especially in the UK and the USA, winter or always. So Northern Hemisphere countries fed birds in winter. They provided them with fat and had a whole heap of personalised recipes just to help them out during the cold months. But mostly society insisted that the second that the weather warmed up, you should stop feeding them for various reasons. These days the debate is leaning towards the feed them always, and this chapter goes into that in a big way. The motivators, of course, are at least partly the industry of providing bird food, multi-million-dollar industry, right? But also a lot of publications and a lot of organizations that are bird organizations started promoting it. They started promoting it in different ways in different parts of the world. So chapter 3 was really interesting. We then go into chapter 4, which is the feeder effect. And the subtitle, What All That Food Can Do. That is one debate that Australians tend to go into. It's like, oh, if you put their food there, it will attract vermin. Anyway, I do feed wild birds, in case you were wondering. It happened accidentally and fairly recently, but it's happening. Okay, so in the feeder effect, it tries to consider if any conclusions can be drawn about how feeders will affect wild birds. And this chapter, as well as the next, have got a very marvellous world distribution. So it goes to all these areas. You've got upper state New York, and you've got suburban London. You've got Oslo and Sweden and Finland and Australia and Wales and New Zealand, and a huge number of species, and it's really, really lush if you are into birds, and in amazingly logical sequencing of events in this book throughout, by the way. The chapters follow each other in such a rational way, and the whole thing builds such a perfect narrative that it's as easy to read as many works of fiction, and easier to read than most. I'm looking at you, Heliconia. I'm looking at you. Okay, in chapter 5, what happens when we feed? So the author actually looks at some actual good scientific examples, and I'd say that chapter 5 is probably the most scientific, because it goes into all these individual actual studies from around the world, but he summarizes a lot. This never fails to be a popular science book, and while the scientific studies are mentioned, you don't get that glut of science that can make it hard for a popular science reader to enjoy. So it looks at many careful food experimentations from around the world, and some of the species in questions were scrub jays in Florida, which I didn't know much about, and that was very interesting. The great tits of Norway, silver eyes in New Zealand. I think also this chapter goes into the hee-hees of New Zealand as well, and chickadees pretty much everywhere, with a final example once again from Australia, Australian magpies. And in all these studies, there were very many unexpected results. So the conclusion is that feeding often, but not always, changes things, but those changes are not always what you'd expect. So if you'd expect you're feeding birds, you'd expect those birds to be more concentrated on the feeding stations, but sometimes they aren't. They'll stop by, but none of these studied actually showed birds the majority of their food came from the feeders. I think 70 to 80% of their food comes from the wild, and the feeders are top-ups. Some of the other unexpected findings were birds that weren't expected to be eating meat, choosing meat, like the lorikeets in Australia, and a whole heap of other things. Anyway, there's so many examples, and they're all so good. Chapter 6 is called Tainted Table, Can Feeding Make Birds Sick? And the short answer is yes, and it talks about how the tables help distribute disease around Europe and the United Kingdom. There's some pretty nasty examples there, but just because birds congregate there, and I think finches was one of the examples, finch disease just spread through migratory birds. But once again, it's complicated and very species dependent. So this chapter comprised several different things. You had the accidental poisons, as in on one occasion, I think it was peanuts that were being fed were contaminated by fungus, and it poisoned a whole heap of birds. And it also talks about how with wild birds, if they're poisoned, the person who's actually feeding them may not have any way of knowing that they're being poisoned by that feeder, because most of them, aside from a couple of specific diseases that affect the eyes, the birds will fly away and be sick elsewhere. There's also a quite horrific example of intentional poisons, where one large feeding grain supply company, not from Australia, though I can't remember from where, intentionally added these poisons and fungicides to keep the feed better for longer, and poisoned birds everywhere. Horrific. And a more incidental type of poison, long-term nutritional deficiencies. So I'll say right now, one thing that a lot of Australians do desperately believe, and many of these are people who work in wildlife rescue, is that by feeding birds, the chicks in the nest won't get the right nutrition that they need from insects and so forth, and they'll grow up with brittle bones. Most of the studies in this book quite clearly show that if you're feeding parents of birds who are feeding chicks, the parents will stop to snack off those breadcrumbs, but they won't take them to the chicks. They'll snack, build up their reserves, go out and get insects and feed the chicks the insects. They do also address the one example that we have on record of a chick choking on a peanut, which was doubtless heartbreaking, but that one story has travelled quite far. Okay, chapter 7 is feeding for a purpose. Supplementary feeding and conservation. This was a great chapter for me. It starts with the heartbreaking story of New Zealand ecology. Anyone who studied zoology or ecology in the Southern Hemisphere probably knows this one. Anyone who's an ornithologist probably will as well. New Zealand is unique in that it has almost no mammals. I think it has 2 endemic tiny mammals, but it just doesn't have them. And it doesn't have a lot of reptiles either. No snakes at all. Kiwis are more terrified of Australian snakes than the UK people are even. What it has is what it had was birds. Birds had expanded to fill every single ecological niche. Many of them were ground birds, some of them were huge, many of them were flightless. And they lived in this almost heavenly sounding country, and then humans landed bringing rats. And it is the story of New Zealand birds is a truly heartbreaking one. But he keeps it short. So yes, Darryl Jones knows the effect of heartbreak, which is to put it down and go away and do something else. So it talks about the ecology, but it moves on fast. And it talks about one barrier island out of Auckland where you still have a virtually intact forest that hasn't been affected by mankind at all. I can't remember the name of the island. It talks about a conservation island again in the Bay of Auckland where they're doing amazing things, and some of these amazing birds can still be seen. He talks about the feeding of the hihis there, but there's also the example of the New Zealand kakapos, and I know about the kakapos, the most amazing birds, and I follow the efforts to keep the species from extinction. There's a Facebook page. I'll try and find it and add it down below. He also talks in chapter 7 about the case of the United Kingdom red kites. Apparently red kites were ubiquitous. They were everywhere in early records, and they were hunted to near extinction until there were just a couple of hundred of them living somewhere in isolated Wales. Then a whole heap of red kites were imported from Spain to build up the species again. So it's a true success story, and part of that is wild bird feeding. But yeah, it's a great story. Chapter 7 it started with a little bit of heartbreak, but I love reading about New Zealand ecology and having those successful rehabilitation ecological studies was great. Okay, number 8 is reasons why we feed birds, and it's a very nice description of organised studies into motivations of feeding around the world. So I've already covered the birds and the feeding studies. Here we've got a whole heap of people who went to study why people feed birds. They did surveys in Australia, in the United Kingdom, pretty sure there was some US ones, and we see some of the same organisations cropping up and again in all the chapters. But a couple of people must have done their dissertations very, very well and condensed down the different notions of why people feed and how they experience it. The amount of research that must have gone into that was absolutely phenomenal. And that brings it down to the same sorts of motivations over and over again around the world, but in slightly different proportions. So they had group 1, pleasure for bird survival, group 2, nurture, children's education, connecting with nature, and group 3, making up for environmental damage and companionship. So the making up for environmental damage or elements of guilt apparently are more of an Australian thing. We know that we've wrecked our environment, and a lot of animals are struggling. Pleasure is across the board, but that seems to be quite high in the United Kingdom. And they were interested in the children's education and the nurture element. And he does talk a little bit about how neurological studies show that encounters with nature are of great personal benefit. They relax people, they make them happier. You can actually detect neurological differences of someone who's taking a walk through the bush versus someone who's taking, or nature, or the forest, or whatever you call it, versus someone who's taking a walk down a busy street. So that was interesting. And onward to chapter 9, where bird feeding matters even more now, the promise and risks of global phenomena. And he goes into point by point why it matters. Feeding birds can change the world because we need birds. Feeders care to see for their pleasure. And a couple of the less positive conclusions are that feeders do spread disease. That is the actual bird feeding station. But a positive one is that most birds who visit feeding stations do actually eat more from nature. And more people are designing the type of food that they're providing for the type of birds that are there. One of the bits that I really liked is his fifth point, feeding changes entire ecosystems, where he says, big call? I don't think so, not anymore. It doesn't take much to link the logic of the preceding statements to the suspicion that all that food must be having a fundamental influence at the ecosystem level. And that includes looking at ducks. Ducks have traditionally been bred, and there have been certain studies done on the eutrophication of the pools where that happens. Anyway, I could ramble on about this book for a while. It's quite a significant book, but it is so beautifully written and so logically laid out that if you're looking for a modern book about urban ecology or birds, or if you just like ecology in general, I would thoroughly recommend this book by Darryl Jones, an Australian urban ecologist, in which you will learn much about birds. No matter who you are, you will learn much about birds, because Darryl Jones, who's been working with them his whole life, says that he learned so much reading this book. So thank you for watching, if you're still watching, and go away and read good books.